Hey, church family. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe and healthy. It's certainly good to be with you on this Wednesday as we get together for a little midweek Bible study and devotional time. And I'm so glad that you've joined us to do just that. On Sundays, we've been in a series called What Counts, and we've really just been walking through the last couple of weeks. What does the Bible have to say about what really counts, about what really matters? And we spent a couple weeks doing that, and we'll actually wrap up our series this Sunday. But this past Sunday, we spent some time looking at how holiness counts. And I thought we'd just spend a few more moments this evening or this afternoon just exploring that idea a little bit more. You've probably heard this phrase before, and no doubt I think I've probably said it before, but the phrase goes something like this: God calls us to be holy, or calls us to holiness, not happiness. God calls us to holiness, not happiness. And there is truth in that, but that's not really the whole truth. And yes, far too many Christians pursue what we think will make us happy, oftentimes falling headlong into patterns of sin and materialism and obsession with success and money and the things of this world. And God calls us to be different. Instead of making the pursuit of happiness our top priority, God calls us to make the pursuit of holiness our top priority. As God says through Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, be holy as I am holy. That's what God calls us to. That is God's number one goal and priority for our lives. But somehow we've got this notion that to be one, or the pursuit of one, requires the sacrifice of the other. To be holy requires sacrificing happiness, and to be happy requires sacrificing holiness. And no doubt sometimes pursuing holiness may require us to make some choices and to go down certain paths that aren't easy, and they are not fun in the moment at least. But the two are definitely not mutually exclusive. I mean, there is profound happiness found in Jesus Christ. In fact, true holiness brings true happiness. And so the call is not to reject happiness in favor of holiness. That doesn't work anyways, at least not in the long run. But I think to understand how the two work together. I like how author Tony Rinke puts it. He says, sin is joy poisoned. That's so true. Sin is joy poisoned. Holiness is joy postponed and pursued. So, for instance, take a verse like Leviticus chapter 9, verse 24. I know you all read Leviticus a whole lot. But there's a verse, take a verse like this. It says, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering on the altar. And when all the people saw it, listen what it says, they shouted for joy and fell face down. This radically holy God sent down fire, holy fire. And what did they do? They fell face down and shouted for joy. This remarkable response flows from the utter holiness of submission combined with the utter happiness of praise. So the two work together. Likewise in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 41, may your holy people be happy because of your goodness. To be holy is to see God as he is and to become like him, covered in Christ's righteousness. And since part of God's nature is to be joyful and happy, the more like him we become, the more joyful and happier we become. Now, to be clear, any understanding of God that's incompatible with the lofty and infinitely holy view of God in places like Ezekiel chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 6, along with the powerful view of the glorified Christ in Revelation, that's just false. In any view of God that detracts from his holiness is just false. God is decidedly and unapologetically anti-sin. He is holy. But in no sense is he somehow anti-happiness. Indeed, holiness is what, in the end, secures our happiness. In Western culture, we often see this mindset that somehow high moral standards are foolish and demeaning and narrow-minded human constructs. And it's just impossible to maintain, and contrary to happiness, that somehow doing what you want and just living however you want to live brings freedom, and somehow these high moral standards and holiness and that pursuit of that somehow brings restriction. And this lie has been remarkably effective. We seem to have to choose between sinning to be happy and abstaining from happiness through self-deprivation. If we believe the lie that saying no to sin means saying no to happiness, then no amount of self-restraint will keep us from ultimately seeking happiness in sin. As John Piper writes, enjoy a superior satisfaction. Cultivate capacities for pleasure in Christ. You were created to treasure Christ with all your heart, more than you treasure sex or sugar or sports or shopping. If you have little taste for Jesus, I love this. If you have little taste for Jesus, competing treasures will triumph. And so holiness doesn't mean abstaining from pleasure. Holiness means recognizing Jesus as the source of life's greatest pleasure. I like how Charles Spurgeon puts it. He says, holiness is the royal road to happiness. The death of sin is the life of joy. And yet too often, our message to the world becomes a false gospel that presents an impossible burden. That to be a Christian, somehow you must give up wanting to be happy and instead choose to be holy. But give up happiness, choose holiness instead, that's not really good news, and therefore it's not really the true gospel. And in fact, in truth, it bears more resemblance to the legalistic worldview of the Pharisees that Jesus condemned. And sadly, when it's viewed as this either-or dilemma, many people will likely choose what appears to be the delightful happiness of the world over what is deemed as this dutiful holiness of the church. And certainly Satan plays a part. He tries to rig the game to leading us to believe, or by leading us to believe, that we can't have both happiness and holiness. Offer people a choice between being hungry and thirsty or having food and drink, and what's your choice going to be? Well, our choice is always going to be, to have food and drink. It's obvious. Never mind that the meal may be laced with cyanide or the drink injected with arsenic, right? Because the reality, though, is that any offer of happiness, with or without holiness, will pretty much always win over an offer of holiness devoid of happiness. But the point is, don't believe the lie that it has to be one or the other, that to pursue holiness somehow means that happiness is sacrificed in the process. Quite the opposite. It's not an either-or dilemma. How little people know who think that holiness is dull, C.S. Lewis wrote. When one meets the real thing, it is irresistible. Even if 10% of the world's population had it, would not the whole world be converted and happy before a year's end? DNA's double helix is perfectly balanced at the core of human life. Two strands wrap around each other, forming an axis of symmetry and providing a perfect complement for each other. And God has made holiness and happiness, I think, to enjoy a similar relationship. Each benefits from the other. For those of us who are Christians, our lives should overflow with both. It's not a choosing one over the other. It should overflow with both. Neither alone is going to suffice. Both together are essential for the truly Christ-centered life. And so when Jesus says, be perfect, we must recognize that true happiness in Him is part of what He intends. Our pleasure is one in the aha moments of discovering firsthand why God's ways really are best. And the more we discover His ways and experience the goodness of His holiness, the more we realize that true happiness really can't be found apart from Him. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.